Step 22 is going to look at how training affects performance. We're going to pay particular attention to the principles of training, which we can see here. This consists of progressive overload, specificity, reversibility, variety, training thresholds, warm-up and cool-down. And then we're also, as well as knowing the principles of training, we need to be able to apply them. So analyse how the principles of training can be applied to both aerobic and resistance training. Our first principle of training is progressive overload. Now, what progressive overload is it means that you need to continually keep training the body at a level that it is not previously accustomed to in order for it to get some benefit out of what it's been doing. Now, progressive overload can be achieved by varying the frequency, duration, and intensity of the training. So, for example, in resistance training, we can do this by increasing the resistance, so put more weight on, the number of reps, so instead of lifting it 6 times, you might lift it 8 times, the number of sets, so from 3 sets to maybe 4 sets, or the intensity, so maybe doing more work or doing 2 exercises instead of just doing 1, so increasing the intensity of how hard we're working. Overload can be progressed in aerobic training by increasing things such as the time spent exercising, so instead of exercising for half an hour, we can now do it for 40 minutes. The frequency of training, the intensity of training, and also to cover a set distance in slightly less time. So maybe instead, if we might run a kilometre in maybe, let's say, 5 minutes. We might challenge the person to run a kilometre 4.5 minutes. So they've got to push themselves a little bit better. And down the bottom, it just mentions that once the body has adapted to a certain level, again, we need to increase the load and repeat the training again. So progressive overload continues. Specificity. What we're looking at here is that training needs to be specific to the sport that we're training for, and also to the energy systems as well as the muscles that are being used within that sport. So, for example, here we've got the cyclist. A cyclist will not get much benefit from swimming due to different muscle groups that are being used. But a squash player may get more benefit from playing tennis, although their technique is slightly different. So for footballers, those who play rugby league, they need to be able to run, they need to be able to tackle, they need to be able to get on the ground, they need to get up. That's specificity. For soccer, they need to be able to run, they need to be fit, they need to have a bit of speed about them. So they'd be training specifically for different elements of the game. Reversibility. So what we're talking about here is the minute you stop training, you're going to lose all the benefits that you've got. So for example, this is up top here. If training is stopped, gains made by the athlete will decline at approximately 1/3 of the rate of acquisition. So I've been training for 3 weeks, I've gotten a lot fitter. If I stop training for one week, I've already lost all the gains that I've got. Even though when I may be injured, athletes should try and maintain some strength, their conditioning, their flexibility throughout the different competition series or sessions, and even just doing some stretching to maintain it. I don't want to lose what I've got. That's the biggest thing here, reversibility. If you don't use it, you will lose it. So we want to make sure we're continually being active. So if it's the off season, or if it's school holidays, or if I'm injured, I still need to do something, whether it be like a single leg row or I do something in the pool that I'm allowed to do, to make sure that I'm continually doing some form of exercise so I'm not losing all the gains I've made. Down the bottom has got an example. An example would include a single leg roll for an injured ankle. They can still do some conditioning. Variety. Variety is all about motivation and reducing the boredom. In a lot of the sports that people will play, they might go for 8 to 10 months of the year. If they did the same thing week in, week out, they get bored very quickly. So the principle of variety is all about trying to mix up the training that they're doing by still getting some value and maybe getting some good work into the athletes, but giving it in a variety of different ways. So, for example, boys that might train here for football at down here at Marist, they might go to Parramatta Stadium once just to try something different. Just mixing up the different sessions, mixing up the skills. If it's the same warm-up every single time, they get bored, just so they maintain their motivation and their boredom levels aren't anywhere near as high. They can reduce them so they're more motivated. That's the big thing. Motivation is the key for variety. So mixing up training sessions to keep people enthusiastic and keen. The training thresholds. Now, there are 2 elements to the training thresholds which we'll go through over the next couple of slides. So we really need to make sure that the students have an understanding of this one. When we talk about the training thresholds, we need to take into consideration our maximum heart rate, which, as it shows here, is worked out by 220 minus the athlete's age. So for a 25-year-old, the athlete has a max heart rate of 195. The lowest threshold an athlete must operate, it's called the aerobic training threshold, and refers to the lowest point at which training is of benefit to the training threshold athlete. It's about 60%. So an athlete who goes out and participates at 60% of their max heart rate, that's the lowest level they can be participating at to get some value out of their training. If they're operating below the 60%, all the fitness work they're doing is of no value to them. When we talk about target heart rates, we're looking at somewhere between, for the aerobic zone, 60 to 80% of their max heart rate. So 60 to 80% of 195 for the 25-year-old would give you the two areas in which they need to train within. If we go to the next area. Once they get that little area and they work within that zone, and we can see here, if we just go down a little bit further, we know that for the 25-year-old athlete, the aerobic training zone is between 60 and 80% of their max heart rate. So 60% of 195 is 117, 80% of 195 is 154. The athlete goes and trains for a period of time. As long as their heart is operating in between this area here, this level, then they'll get some benefit and some gains out of what they've been doing. If they're below 117, let's say they're 110 or 100 beats per minute, it's no value to them, it's a waste of time. If they're above 154, they're then going to cross into the anaerobic training threshold because they're operating at a very high intensity. So again, they're not getting any value for the aerobic training. So aerobic, as long as we're all clear, aerobic is between 60 to 80% of their max heart rate. We then move on to the anaerobic training threshold. So obviously this one's going to be, if we know that we'll go back one slide, the aerobic is 60 to 80%. Anaerobic could be anywhere from 85 to 100%. Because obviously being anaerobic, oxygen is not required, so therefore it's a lot shorter, more intense. So the intensity of the training needs to be a lot higher. The big concern for the anaerobic threshold is the OBLA, which is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. What this talks about, and we spoke about it when we went through the energy systems, and we mentioned the lactic acid system. You go up on the top oval and you start to go for a sprint. Being anaerobic, it's going to be a high intensity, so above 80%. You're going to start, at some stage through that little performance, you're going to start to get lactic acid building up in the muscles, which is going to cause fatigue. What you need to be able to do is increase that threshold. So fatigue, or the lactic acid build up in the muscles, takes longer. So as it mentions here, athletes can try and work on the lactic acid system and train at a high intensity. So their OBLA, or the onset of blood lactate accumulation, is a little bit higher, so they can perform at that higher intensity for a longer period of time before lactic acid starts to be produced in the muscles and causes fatigue and makes them slow down. So let's just recap on a few of these before we jump in the next slide here. Aerobic threshold, between 60 to 80% of your max heart rate, which is 220 minus your age. The anaerobic threshold is above the 80% mark, which is going to be of a much higher intensity because they're working at a higher level, trying to reduce the onset of blood lactate. The longer they can perform at the higher intensity before blood lactate accumulation starts to be formed in the muscles, the better the performance will be. This graph here just gives you an idea of the different training thresholds for aerobic and anaerobic. And if you look on the left-hand side here, we have heart rate. Down the bottom, we have the age. So as the age decreases, starts at 70, works its way down to 20. Heart rate starts here at 60 and works its way up to 200. You'll notice that the heart rate, or the intensity of the training, or how high the heart rate can be pushed, or how high the body can be pushed, starts to increase. And the same with the max heart rate, based off 220 minus their age. So that's all that little graph is there. The last area for the principles of training is warm-up and cool-down. And all this talks about here is for a warm-up, making sure that the warm-up can be broken into three sections. A general body warm-up, some stretching, and an activity specific to where the certain muscle groups are being used in the sport. So for soccer, it might be we go out and we go for a little bit of a jog up and down the field. We come in, we do some form of stretching, and we've gone in on our previous dot points, we've spoke about the different types of stretching. There could be a little bit of dynamic stretching going on here. So some high knees, some butt kicks, some karaoke, some walking lunges, some of these different stretches, some leg swings for the hamstring as well at the end. And then the athlete might go off into the specific area, which might be some with the soccer ball, some passing, some dribbling, some up around, 2-on-1 with the soccer ball passing, some shots at goal for the keeper, some heading practice, all those things that are specific to the sport they're about to do. So the idea of the warm-up is to prepare the body for the activity that's about to be performing in, to reduce the chance of an injury, and make sure the muscles are right and they've all had a proper stretch. And again, we can go through the different types of stretching, which we all know. The cool-down is effectively the warm-up in reverse. So we warm up the muscles to prepare them for what they're doing. When we have the cool-down, what we're trying to do is get rid of all the lactic acid that builds up, all the waste products that builds up in the muscles following the activity. So therefore, we're going to reduce the chances of having some stiffness occurring so that the athlete can perform better. So the warm-up might be just sort of some form of a light jog, bit of movement. Okay, just some movement, whether it be a little bit of light jogging, some walking, just to get the blood flowing still around the muscles, and then having some form of a little bit of a stretch. So that's the warm-up. Sorry, the warm-down, which is just a warm-up in reverse. We've gone through and we've looked at the principles of training here. We all should know them now. They're pretty simple, but what we need to be able to do is be able to apply them to aerobic and resistance training. That's what the syllabus is asking us to do. When we talk about to train the body anaerobically, training needs to be pretty much a flat-out high intensity, which we spoke about with the training thresholds. To overload the anaerobic system, you can increase the length of the sprints being undertaken or include more repetitions of sprints. So instead of 50 metres, it might be 60 metres. Instead of doing 10 lots of 50, it might be 14 lots of 50. Intensity can be determined by heart rate, pace, or the lactic threshold. You can tell in the muscles. Frequent training sessions, perhaps maybe 4 times per week for a duration of 8 to 10 weeks are suggested to get some improvements. Developing aerobic conditioning relies on similar principles to above. However, the main difference has to be the intensity of the training that's going to be taking place. If we're training the aerobic system, we're going to be nowhere near as intense as we would be with the anaerobic system. So that's a big difference between the two. Remember the syllabus spoke to us about providing it to strength training and aerobic training. So if we look at the overload and specificity principles are easily applied to strength training. Strength exercises should be specific to the predominant energy system being involved. When I say using strength that's going to be specific to the sport, that's easy. The other one is gains in strength are more pronounced or they're easier to see and people can achieve more if muscles are progressively overloaded. So when we've already spoke about overload, but again for resistance we can do this by increasing the number of times a single weight is lifted, so the reps, increasing the weight, so more load being put on the exercise, and then or even increasing the number of sets that someone might be doing. Stretching should be carried out on the specific muscles, tendons and ligaments that will be used in the sport or activity, so there's our specificity part. And again, the techniques here that should stress, make sure there's full range of motion so it's properly being stretched. And improvement, and by doing this, improvements in flexibility do occur when practiced and overloaded. So by stretching, if I sat down now and stretched my hamstring, if I continually kept stretching my hamstring every couple of days for a period of weeks, I would notice an improvement in my flexibility. This is just a table here that I've put in there for the boys to go through just to show the application of what the syllabus asks us to do. All we're doing is we're applying the different principles of training to both aerobic and strength training. And I believe if you can go through and complete this table in good detail with a very good understanding of the principles of training, then you'll have this dot point covered quite well.